Hello, I'm here with Andrew Gwynne today. Do you want to explain a bit about yourself and what positions you've held before?
So I'm Andrew Gwynne. I'm the Member of Parliament for Denton and Reddish, which is a constituency straddling Tameside and Stockport on eastern Greater Manchester. Been the MP since 2005, and I've had a number of positions in Parliament over the 16 years I've been there, from Parliamentary Private Secretary to the Home Secretary, Jackie Smith, and Ed Balls when he was the Children's and Education Secretary, through to junior shadow minister roles in transport, health and public health. And more recently, I was in the shadow cabinet, firstly as a minister without portfolio, so effectively the one that does all the morning media rounds and is a bit of an attack dog, through to the Shadow Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government. And during that time, I was also the Labour Party's National Campaign Coordinator alongside Ian Lavery.
Yeah, like you said, you entered Parliament in 2005 as Labour's youngest MP, I believe. What was it like being the youngest MP, only 30 years old?
Oh, it was very daunting and a huge privilege, because I represent the place where I've always lived, where I've grown up, where I went to school, and where I brought my own family up as well. So I always think, it sounds really corny this, but I always think it's an extra special privilege and a bit more of a pressure to represent your home community, because look, if I mess up, I've still got to come home at the weekend and look my friends, my family and my neighbours in the face. So it's that double pressure, but also immense pride. To represent anywhere in Parliament is a huge privilege, but to represent your home community is extra special. And most of the time I love it. It has its moments, but to be able to speak in the House of Commons, to be the only person who can speak in the House of Commons for your home community, is really a privilege. And I also enjoy getting mucky on the ground in Denton and Reddish, getting involved with community projects, helping people out. I'm a real hands-on Member of Parliament, and some of the best things, when people ask me what are your best achievements of an MP, they're not speeches that I've made in the House of Commons, they're not bills that I've passed in the House of Commons, it's things that I've done to help real people here in my home community.
Yeah. Do you think it makes it a little bit easier representing your own constituency as you understand the area and people more?
Oh, I think it makes it easier in that respect, because you understand the issues, the people, the communities. But as I say, it is a double-edged sword. I was an MP in the expenses scandal. Now, thankfully, I wasn't fingered for anything in that scandal. Plenty of my colleagues on both sides of the House were, some unfairly, some fairly. But that brought it home to you that this is a privilege. And, if I messed up in any way, just that sense of disappointment that your home community would have in you, it's more than a job. It's where you live. It's where you hope to continue living. And so there is that extra pressure not to mess up or try not to. And it's not easy. Sometimes there are very difficult issues. Brexit is a case in point. I campaigned to remain. I recognise we lost the referendum. And my constituency voted very heavily by a substantial margin to leave the European Union. And all of my time in the shadow cabinet was wrestling with the view that we had to honour the referendum, not least because constituents in places like the constituency I represent would never understand why the Labour Party, which is supposed to stand for democratic principles, democratic rights, would seek to overturn or ignore a democratic vote. And I was always very vocal in shadow cabinet about that. I always felt very strongly that whilst we had a balancing act to do, we should never leave the electorate with the impression that we know better than them, having had a democratic vote. And that was probably the trickiest time in all the time that I've been an MP, where the perception wrongly was that I was at odds with my own constituents.
Yeah. And on your cabinet career, how did you find it becoming a junior cabinet minister and going in with no cabinet experience before when you became a private secretary to the Home Secretary?
Well, I mean, that was fascinating. Look, it's a huge privilege to be anywhere on the rungs of the ladder of government, and being a parliamentary private secretary is a bit of a thankless job, because you get all the jobs of organising the backbenchers, getting questions submitted, but you also have the huge privilege of sitting in with your boss in a whole range of meetings. And some of the meetings, particularly in the Home Office, I'd probably have to kill you even now if I let slip some of the things that I heard or was party to. And huge privilege to work with great people, Jackie Smith and Ed Balls, very different people, but both were incredible bosses to work for, and to just sit there and to watch them and to listen to them and to be part of the decision-making process, albeit at a very junior level, wasn't just fascinating, it was a great steep learning curve as well, and hopefully one that won't be wasted at some stage in the future, because as Labour heads even further away from its period in government, there will be fewer and fewer people in the House of Commons on the Labour side that will have direct experience either as a minister or as an aide to a minister, as I was, and understanding how departments work, how ministers work, how the civil service works becomes a distant memory. And that was the problem that we had in 1997 after 18 years of opposition. And it may well be a problem that the next Labour government has as well, in that there will be very few people left that have that collective memory of Labour in government. And I suppose I'm privileged, albeit at a very junior level, to be one of those people that knows what it's like for the Labour Party to be in government and to see Labour ministers making decisions that change people's lives.
Yeah. And you resigned from your shadow cabinet position one day after Keir Starmer was elected. How do you feel like Keir Starmer is doing, and what do you think Labour's future is going to be?
Yeah, well, I just decided that after several years in the shadow cabinet and a decade on the front bench in opposition, that it was time to have a rest. I've had some health issues with long COVID, and before that I was just absolutely tired. Being National Campaign Coordinator and a Shadow Secretary of State was a lot of work, and it tired me out, and I needed time to rest and recuperate, and that's really where I am now. And I'm actually quite enjoying life on the backbenches, because I've had very little time on the backbenches over the years, and so I just think it was time for something new. In terms of Keir, look, it's the most unenviable job in Parliament, being the leader of the opposition, and to be leader of the opposition just at the moment that we go into a massive global pandemic where Parliament's effectively shut down, and the only game in town is the government making key decisions on how we tackle coronavirus, has probably wiped the best part of 15 months out of the plan to get Labour into the position where people are listening to it, people are taking us seriously, people are taking a look at us not just as an opposition party but as a credible alternative government. And that really ramps up the pressure now as things start to be switched back on, and things go back to normal, that effectively we've lost the best part of 15 months, 16 months in what is probably going to be a 4-year parliament. And so we've got to redouble our efforts to make sure that that renewal of the Labour Party happens, it continues at pace, and that people see the Labour Party as a serious alternative to this government. And, that's no mean feat, given that we could have a general election in 2023, which is really only round the corner.
Yeah. On your point of stepping down from the shadow cabinet, do you find it's a lot easier to represent your constituency when you don't have other interests in government, whether that's a cabinet position or deputy speaker or chair, or whatever it may be?
Well,
Do you think it's easier?
absolutely. I mean, look, collective responsibility is really important. And I feel very strongly that if you take the shilling, even though you don't get paid in the shadow cabinet, but if you effectively take the shilling, you have to abide by the rules of collective responsibility. And we used to have huge debates in shadow cabinet about a range of issues, and I didn't agree with the collective position that we came to on everything. As I've already said, Brexit was an incredibly hard decision, and I'm even to this day not sure that the Labour Party's position going into the 2019 general election was the best one we could have had. It was very difficult for me to explain as a shadow cabinet member. And look, if we can't explain it coherently, it probably wasn't the best or most coherent position. But that was the collective decision that the party came to, that the shadow cabinet, the party conference and so on came to. And if you're in the team, you have to accept that that's the majority view. It did put me at odds with my own constituents who thought that it was at best evasive and at worst an attempt to overturn their democratic vote. And, we paid the price at the polls, not just across the country where we had a battering at that general election, but here in my own constituency where the vote went down by more than 12%. A huge drop in the Labour vote, and a large part of that, not the sole reason, but a large part of that was our position or perceived position on Brexit. And that's going to take some time to mend, because it is still live in people's minds that the Labour Party wasn't on their side. The fact that we were in a no-win situation because as many of our constituencies were Remain constituencies as were Leave constituencies really shows how difficult it is to hold the left of centre coalition together, because there are two very different wings within that coalition. You've kind of got your middle class, professional people who tended to vote Remain and voted Labour in 2019 by very substantial numbers, and then you've got your working class communities that tended to vote Leave in large parts of the country that drifted away from us. And building and rebuilding that coalition is really going to be the challenge in the however many months left we've got before the next general election. And it's one that I know the front bench and Keir are attuned to, but also Boris Johnson and the government are attuned to it. And that's why they're talking our language about levelling up. Now, the proof of the pudding in all of that is going to be in the eating and seeing whether levelling up really happens, whether areas that have been stripped of resources, stripped of funding, that the public services have been scaled back and in many cases decimated, whether we're going to see a real reversal in that, I'm not sure. I think that the levelling up is precisely rhetoric from the government, but they're talking our language, and that does make it more difficult for us to get a fair hearing on these issues.
Yep. I just quickly wanted to move over to when you chaired Labour Friends of Israel. What do you make of the situation currently in Israel and Palestine?
Oh, it's a dreadful situation. Look, it's one of the biggest global injustices and problems and flashpoints, and has been for 7 decades. The Middle East peace process really needs to be put back on track, and I very much hope that the new Israeli government, which is a very far-reaching coalition of some very strange bedfellows, but I really hope that they are able to halt the settlement building on the occupied Palestinian territories in the West Bank. I really hope that we can get the Palestinian Authority into some semblance of organisation. There haven't been elections there for a very long time. Obviously, the Fatah movement are very frightened of going to the polls because they fear they'll lose out to the Hamas, and I think that there's a realistic issue there that could happen. But the Palestinian Authority has to be functioning again, and both Israel and the Palestinians have to come to some recognition that the two-state solution is the only real game in town, and that needs discussion. And look, the frustrating thing is that whenever I've been out there and spoken to politicians both in Israel and in the Palestinian territories, the real frustration for outsiders is the two sides are much more close than anybody would give credit for. They all know what the kind of final agreement is going to look like, that there will be a Jewish state roughly on the footprint of Israel. There will be a Palestinian state roughly on the footprint of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. There will be some minimal land swaps on either side because the Palestinians want a land corridor between the West Bank and Gaza. Understandably, that will take territory from Israel, and the quid pro quo will be that some of the land that settlements have been built on the edge of the Green Line will probably be negotiated as a quid pro quo. But fundamentally, there will be two states. They will be viable states. There will be shared water resources. There will be probably an economic free trade area covering both areas. There will be security cooperation, and Jerusalem will have to be a shared capital of both the Palestinians and Israelis. And however hard that is, particularly for some on the Israeli side, that is really where this is heading. And if we can get them, both the Israelis and Palestinians, to have that last leap of faith, we may well resolve one of the longest standing injustices. And, you know, it is long overdue, and it is so chronically needed, not just for Israel and the Palestinians. It's so chronically needed as a global community to right this injustice.
Yeah. And a last question, would you ever want to return to the cabinet or even possibly running for leader in the future?
Oh, I'm not sure about running for leader. There's not a vacancy, and you know, if everything goes right and we end up with a Labour government, there hopefully won't be a vacancy for a very long time. Would I return to the front bench if I was asked? Probably. You know, it's an honour to serve in whatever capacity. It's great being a member of Parliament. I'm loving being a backbencher because I can say and do things I haven't been able to for probably around 15 of the 16 years that I've been a member of Parliament. I'm able to champion some of the causes that are really close to my heart, the environment, human rights, and a whole range of issues on tackling inequality here in the UK. But if Keir Starmer was going to pick up the phone and offer me a position, I would probably take it and be very grateful for the opportunity to serve on the front line again. I'm not sure whether that will happen, but who knows? You never say never in this game.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your time today. And yeah.
Thank you.
Have a nice rest of your evening.
Yeah, you too.